The topic of narcissism, boundaries, or more broadly speaking, like toxic relationships definitely come up. It's a big reason why people seek individual counseling. And so I'm happy to talk to you guys about that. Um, One thing, Jillian, you wanted me to speak broadly about narcissism, and I wrote down a couple of things I wanted to say about this topic because I think we use the word loosely, and
Yeah.
that's fine. From a clinical perspective, narcissistic personality disorder is a diagnosable mental health disorder, but it is rarely diagnosed. And by rarely, we think that in the general population, that people with narcissistic personality disorder might be anywhere from 0.5% of the population up to 5 or 6% of the population. So what that means is anywhere from like 95 to 99.5% of people do not have narcissistic personality disorder. They may have traits of narcissism. They may be completely a pain in the neck to work with and to be around. They may be very hurtful. They may be very harmful people. But generally speaking, most people are not diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. And there's a big reason for that. And I want to, and the main reason is people with narcissism don't come to therapy. They don't think that there's anything wrong with what they're doing. They don't think that what they're doing is hurtful. They don't, if even if they do think they're hurting you, they don't care. So people rarely show up in psychotherapy offices where we kind of collect this data, seeking help for the narcissism. But I can think in the last 8 years, I've had exactly one person show up and actually in my own practice call and say, I think I'm a narcissist. No, I lie. I've had two. Two people said, I think I'm a narcissist. One person absolutely was not a narcissist. Um, they were dealing with anxiety and tried to control things as a result of that. And the other person, after talking to the person on the phone for about 5 minutes, I just said, look, I can't help you. No other therapist has ever been able to help you. The things that you're dealing with are not, I'm just not willing to take you on as a client. I was able to say the reasons why without, um, just being direct with the person. I'm not willing to work with someone who is a manipulative liar, who has gone through 17 therapists in the last year and, doesn't really want to be there, but is being threatened with divorce. It's just not something I can help. Um, that's part of my screening intake is to help people that to help to get the right people that I can help. Anyhow, my point is narcissists don't call therapists. So with that being said, if someone has narcissistic personality or has traits of narcissism, and we'll talk about that in a minute, yes, sometimes they can be helped, but they have to really want the help. They have to really want it for themselves. It's not because their wife told them they need to come, and it's not because, their boss is getting ready to fire them. They have to want to change. That's the same for anybody, whether you have narcissism or, you're narcissistic or not. They have to really, really want it. And if it's been a pervasive, which is one of the signs of personality disorders, you're not reacting to a situation, it's pervasive, it's lifelong, it's, it maybe in adolescence you started to emerge this way. It takes a lot of time to undo that learned behavior. And usually, the newest line of thinking, and certainly has been my experience with people who hold on to these really harsh traits, is that there's usually some history of abuse or some kind of psychological damage stemming from childhood, and that takes a lot to heal. And so narcissism is a way that people have learned to be in their environment. And so, yes, these people can get help. Yes, they can heal potentially, but it takes a lot of work, and most people aren't willing to put in the work. But I do want to just say before we jump into questions, a couple of things I wanted to define. So, narcissistic personality disorder, as I said, is a very, very small percent of the population, but there are lots of people with narcissistic traits. And some of those traits that probably the people here are familiar with, I know I'm familiar with, and people that I've met in my life. Um, so one would be that they have this overarching sense of superiority or like a superiority complex. They really think they're grand. They really think that everything they're doing is right. And how can people not admire them the way that they should be admired? And you know, why are they not treated with this special sort of admiration? So they really have a desire to be admired. Under that, psychologically, we know that they actually have a very, very low self-esteem and they very much lack confidence, but they put on this inflated ego to sort of protect against that. Um, People who are narcissistic are often very defensive to criticism. None of us like to be criticized. None of us like to have our flaws pointed out. But people that have narcissistic tendencies may become angry. They might become violent. They might become extremely, they might cut you off completely from their life if you say the slightest, give them the slightest bit of feedback, which is another reason why therapy really doesn't work in these sort of situations, because therapy does involve a lot of not criticism, but feedback for change. These people will engage in a lot of manipulative behaviors. They'll engage in lying, and always with the pursuit of getting what they want. You'll notice that people with narcissism lack empathy. So where you and I might be able to feel another person's pain, or might be able to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, even if we don't agree with what's going on, someone who's narcissistic will really lack that ability to see things from someone else's perspective, nor do they care to. You might find this person is hot and cold or two-faced. They might be nice to you in 1 minute and mean to you the next, and that can be very confusing. They're going to be self-absorbed, and they're going to be arrogant, as we've mentioned, with the overinflated ego. They're going to have a sense of entitlement. So maybe you're going to be waiting in the line at the movie theater, and they're going to feel like they don't have to wait in the line. Maybe they should be able to go to the front of the line. And essentially, they're going to do whatever it takes to get what they want. And I want to say that if you've been involved with someone who's narcissistic or has these kind of traits, you're going to feel really fragile. You're going to feel really confused. You're going to question your own reality. You're going to wonder if something's wrong with you, because that's what happens when you've been engaged in psychological abuse, in a relationship with somebody who's abusive. And Jillian, if it's okay, I just want to say one other thing about abuse, because this is really important. People get confused about this. Of course, we know about abuse as, hitting or kicking or intimidating someone physically, but abuse can take so many different forms. In a narcissist world, it's usually emotional or psychological. So it's mind games, it's manipulation, it's gaslighting. And gaslighting is just another phrase that you guys are going to hear about and you've heard about, but it's basically psychological abuse with the intent to distort the victim's reality. So, your narcissistic spouse trips you in the kitchen and you spill your coffee and you get called clumsy, even though you know that they put their foot out and they tripped you and they've turned it around and they've distorted your reality. So there's the psychological abuse. There's also sexual abuse. Even though you're married, if you don't want to have sex, you don't have to. If you don't want to have sex in a certain way, you don't have to. But sexual abuse takes place in marriages and relationships. Financial abuse happens frequently in narcissistic relationships. So financial abuse might look like withholding your access to money, to family money, or might be giving you an impossibly low budget to do the family grocery shopping. It might be hiding accounts, right? Another type of abuse would be spiritual abuse, either forcing a faith on you or isolating you from your chosen faith. So I just want people to know that abuse goes well beyond physical abuse. And I don't even know that that's an exhaustive list, but it's certainly how I see things show up sometimes. And I'm happy to answer any questions about everything I just said there.
Thank you so much, Carrie. That was a wonderful introduction to the topic of narcissism. A few key points I just wanted to reiterate that I'm really grateful that you brought up. Thank you for talking about the fact that it's not common for a narcissist to even want to go to therapy or agree to therapy because there's nothing wrong with them. They're not the one that needs fixing. And I know that can be really frustrating from a perspective of a loved one who's dealing with it. Well, how can we move past it if we're not going to go to therapy to get help? So thank you for pointing that out. Thank you also for mentioning that there are some people who have these narcissistic tendencies, but are maybe not a full-blown narcissist. That's an important distinction. And we can talk about that more too, because I think sometimes that can be a blessing, whereas maybe there is kind of a little bit more leeway for getting the assistance that those family members need. And then thank you for talking about the different forms of abuse. I think that's really important. And I just want all of our members to know, and anyone who might be listening to this after the fact, that if something feels wrong, it is wrong. And even if you don't know exactly why it's wrong, if it feels wrong, it is. And it's important to get the support and the advice and the assistance you need to overcome that, because we all deserve to feel comfortable, safe, and loved. So thank you so much. We are going to start with just a few questions that were sent in ahead of time. And then I definitely want to get to some questions in the chat, or anybody who wants to just kind of speak up If there's anything just like really pressing that needs to be said, use the raise hand emoji or the chat feature, and I'll definitely see it and bring it up. And then at the end, please don't let me forget, I want to get all of your contact information up on the screen so that people can reach out and ask for help after the fact if they need some therapy. Okay. So one of the first questions we had is, are people born a narcissist, or is it something that develops over time?
So that's a really interesting question. And you can Google this topic. As mental health therapists, we use Google as much as you guys, and we have other tools, but basically, if you look up any of our mental health disorders, and narcissists being right there with it, they don't really know where certain things come from. The etiology, what we call like the origin of these things, aren't really known. I can tell you, I work from a trauma perspective, a trauma-informed perspective, which means I follow the latest research on how childhood trauma impacts people later in life. And in my experience, when I'm working with usually the spouse of someone or the adult child of someone who was raised by someone with narcissistic tendencies, when I inquire about that person's upbringing or what was their life like, and tell me about your spouse and where were they raised and who raised them, or your mother, what was it like in 1945 when your mother was being raised? What was that household like? There's always abuse. I've never once heard, they came from a loving family, they had lots of money, that, the children were well cared for. It's so I really lean into that research about it's a way that people have learned to cope in their environment. And some of those strategies, they might have been survival techniques, lying to get what you wanted, not caring about how you hurt other people's feelings, trying to make yourself out bigger and better than you are. Those might have been effective coping skills when you were a little boy at the hands of abusive parents or neglectful parents, but they're not going to work in your adult relationships. So while, there's no gene test that we can do for narcissism, there's no, blood test or anything like that. I do think that people develop these narcissistic, self-centered positions because it worked for them at some point, and probably it worked because they were being mistreated as children. It's definitely what I see. It's definitely what trauma-informed research is starting to uncover, that there's a trauma basis for these people, and that can help us understand where they're coming from. It doesn't excuse the behavior, and it doesn't mean that it's okay, but it can start to help us understand why people develop in such a way. I'm just not personally comfortable with thinking that some children are just born terrible human beings. I just don't, that's not ever been my experience clinically, professionally, or in my own personal life. Usually people are reacting to something that has happened to them.
I appreciate it. Thank you. I think it's really important that you mentioned that a diagnosis can be a reason, but not an excuse. So we can feel compassion and we can feel empathy and we can have a sense of understanding where these behaviors come from, but it still does not make it excusable behavior. Exactly. I think that was really important to bring up. So thank you. Another question we had was effective co-parenting strategies with a narcissist. So strategies to help yourself and your kids when, if you aren't together, but you're co-parenting, how do you approach that without causing more conflict?
That's such a good question. And I hope that this will be helpful. This conversation will be helpful for people who are in co-parenting situations. So one of the things that's really important to understand about a narcissist, and we've said this again, and we'll say it again and again and again, narcissists don't think anything's wrong with them. They don't understand why you're so emotional. They don't understand why you're overreacting. They don't understand why what they're asking for isn't granted straight away. So you have to hold that and understand that. They're never going to understand your perspective. So a couple of things have to happen. You have to understand their perspective because you have the mental flexibility and the emotional capability to do so, right? So you have to understand the framework that you're in, not the framework that you wish you were in. That can take a lot, but it is important once you grasp that with a healthy sense of detachment of like, okay, this is who that person is. I don't like anything about their personality or how they're handling this, but I understand this is how they operate, right? So the intent can't be to change your narcissistic ex-husband. But tips. So first of all, you're going to limit your interactions with them. First and foremost, you're just not going to engage with them all that often. When you do, there's going to be a purpose to it. And it's going to be within whatever the guidelines are that that you and your mediator came up with, or you and your divorce lawyer came up with, or if you haven't gone through a formal process where you have a written document that explains your co-parenting arrangement, you're going to have some guidelines. We have handoffs on Sunday afternoons and they happen at 2:00. And you're going to stick within those arrangements. You're going to keep your interactions small. Anytime you're interacting with them, you're going to refrain from being emotional and from using emotional language. So, for example, your spouse does not show up at 2 o'clock as you've arranged with them. They show up at 2:30. And your first response is, my gosh, you made me so angry. I was worried sick. Where have you been? This is so unfair to me. That's an emotional response. It's all valid, but not with the narcissist. What you say is, our agreement is that we meet at 2 o'clock and I need you to be here at 2 o'clock. There's no emotion in that. There's no room for gray. It's just fact. We arranged to meet at 2 o'clock and you are late, period. No matter what else is going off in your head, you have to stop it there. So you want to be concise, you want to be direct, and you want to be non-emotional with them. As soon as you give them some emotion, they run with that. And they're going to manipulate it and they're going to turn it around on you. You also want to just like avoid getting sucked into the drama and the web that they create, and that all of their interactions you sort of cast. There's just this web that you can get really quickly drawn into, and you can be really far down or sucked into that hole before you realize it. So limit your engagements, stop and pause before you say anything. It's difficult if you're in a interactive situation, you're face to face with them, but if you're texting with them, emailing them, or there's some kind of, if there's any space you can create for you to stop and think about like what you want to say and how you want to say it, that can be really helpful. I will say for some couples, doing everything by writing can be helpful. For other couples, limiting the writing, the written word can be helpful. That's going to depend on how you interact best with your ex. Writing does give you time to think about things. However, it can be screenshotted, it can be recorded, it can be passed on. A verbal conversation cannot. I think also with co-parenting, you really want to avoid falling for any kind of failed promises. Oh, I'll never do that to you again. Don't worry, I've changed. I know what I did was wrong in the past. Just come back to me. Just you've lived in that cycle long enough to separate or divorce from that person. I think trust yourself that even if the person has changed, you don't need to be part of their future. I think that's really important. The other thing, from a legal perspective about co-parenting with a narcissist or somebody with narcissistic tendencies, you want to document everything. You want to follow your parenting agreements to a T. You want to take copies of everything, birth certificate, social security cards, any kind of legal documents, screenshot things, record things. Keep your own log where transgressions have happened, where people are late for appointments or not turning up to, for a handoff on time, or where the kids are missing school on their days, or where they're not going to the doctors when they're with one parent. You want to document everything, and then take copies of it, right? Because a narcissist, if they find out that you're documenting everything and you've got this awesome file in your living room in this nice little binder, a narcissist will be very happy to take that binder when they're dropping the kids off. So make copies, hide things. And this is not good advice in healthy relationships. We don't make copies and hide things and record things in healthy relationships. But when you're in an unhealthy relationship, this is extremely important. The other thing is, I do want to temper this with, I'm not giving you legal advice, and that's not my area of expertise. But as much as you may wish to record, like secretly record your narcissistic spouse, record them doing something, I think you can do that, but I don't think it's legal, and I don't think it's admissible in court. So if you think, oh, I'm going to take a recording of him, he's not going to know that I have this recording of him doing this thing, I'm going to show it to the judge. It doesn't work like that. If it makes you feel better and you want to show it to your lawyer or your therapist, maybe that's okay. I don't really know. But I have had cases where, certain things have happened and it's not admissible in court. So when I'm saying record things, like I'm saying record legally things and with people's permissions, and take record and duplicates of everything that's important to your family and to your case, especially when the person is not following the agreement, or consistently late, or kids are not going to school on their days, or not doing their homework on those days. Those are all easy to track and record.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I think that was a great point, saying that this advice is not for healthy relationships. That's a really great distinction. If you feel like you have to do these things in your relationship, that's probably a good indicator that there's something out of balance in that relationship. Before we move
Yes.
on to another question, does anyone in the group right now have any kind of follow-up questions for this topic before we move on, or anything you want to share personally about this?
So, yeah, I have a quick question, and I deal with my ex-husband who is has narcissistic tendencies. But I guess one of the question is, how do we deal with them pushing some of their narcissistic tendencies onto the children, in terms of kind of, bad mouthing the parent, the other parents, and then, oh, your mom won't let you go to this or whatever. What are some tips that we can provide for our children if we notice that whenever they're going to their parents, they're coming back and they're just having a lot of anger emotions towards the other parent, those types of things?
Thank you, Jody. That's a really hard one, and it will depend on a couple of things. It'll depend on the age of your kids and their own emotional capabilities as far as like understanding things. So how you might handle that with a teenager versus like a 3 or 5 year old could potentially be different. But I can't stress enough the importance of therapy for the children during any divorce, even if, a separation, even if it's healthy and everybody's kind of getting along in this sort of ideal way as you're separating and changing the structure of the family. Therapy can be so helpful, and it doesn't have to be long term, it may be short term, but just giving those kids a safe place to be with a therapist who can help them sort out their feelings and start to see the reality of their situation, accept that can is so important. It's doubly extremely important if there's any sort of high conflict, if there's narcissism, if there's other, really intense mental health disorders going on within one or both of the family member or parents, in that situation. Therapy for the kids is really, really important. And also I'm a huge proponent of like family therapy, to the degree that you can. And this can be really hard with someone who's narcissistic, but having everybody, even mom and dad as they're separated or divorced, in the room with the parents in a family structured with a qualified family therapist who can help you guys work through the dynamics that are causing the kids to act out can be extremely helpful. But Jody, to your specific question about like what are some tips, what are some things, I think, when you're picking your kids up and they're coming home and says, Daddy said you won't let me go there on Wednesday night, or Daddy says, I can't go with him this weekend because it's your weekend. I think you have to just go back to that really like, I know you're frustrated, buddy. I know you wanted to go see Daddy on Wednesday night, or I can see that you're really sad. You want to validate their feelings, help them label some of what's going on for them, and then be as direct and short, because you're talking about, in most cases, little kids, because 13, 14, 16-year-olds, they start to see and understand exactly what's going on, especially today's kids with TikTok and YouTube and all the videos they're watching. They're emotionally intelligent kids, many of them are. But with little kids, you just want to say, I'm sorry that Daddy said that, but Wednesday nights are our family night when you're at this house, and these are the things that we do. And Daddy gets to see you, every Sunday. You just kind of clear the air, but as quickly and concisely with as few words, because kids get confused if you use a lot of words. But first, I would validate their feeling, whatever that may be. They're sad, they're scared, they're angry, they're frustrated, they're confused. I mean, right? You guys are in relationship with narcissists. Confusion is a big one. Help them label that, get under that, and then just kind of set the record straight about what rules of engagement you're following. There's also a ton of books, and I don't have any titles to hand, but again, depending on your children's age, if you use Pinterest or your local librarian or Amazon, there are lots of books that are excellent storybooks for children who are going through divorce or changing the structure of their family, or living with someone who's incarcerated or someone who died. There's lots of books like I grew up with the Berenstain Bears as an example of characters in a book, or Peppa Pig or Olivia the Pig. There's lots of characters in books who address these big topics, and we call that bibliotherapy. So reading to children about their situation, but not talking about them. So I can think of a book two books. I have two homes, and it wasn't the chocolate pudding, or two books that come to mind when you're talking about divorce, where you're talking about storybooks with pictures and you're talking about another family who's going through a separation and divorce process. It gives language and understanding, and then you and your child can facilitate a conversation if the child brings it up about how their family might relate to this storybook.
Thank you
Thank
so
you so
much.
much.
I think also one thing you had mentioned that I think is really important, you had said sometimes a narcissist will say something like, I promise I'll change. And sometimes people from the outside will wonder, well, what did you ever see in this person? This person's behavior is so terrible. Why did you ever marry this person? Why did you ever have children with this person? And I think I just want to mention and maybe have you validate the fact that narcissists can be extremely charming. And they
Sure.
can come across as the most charming, most wonderful, kind-hearted person at first. So you might
Mhm.
fall in love with someone, and then later the narcissism or the narcissistic traits or those tendencies start to come out. So if you can just speak on that for a moment, I think that might help alleviate some of the guilt or confusion.
Yeah, that's a really good point, right? So narcissists are extremely intelligent. And again, I don't know the data on this, but they can be, I mean, they're smart, right? So they know exactly what they're doing. So they reel you in, they say the right things, they create an environment, and they bring you into their world, and you think that their world is one way. And then you get married, you walk down the aisle, and within days, if not weeks or months, maybe your honeymoon, something has changed. And usually, in my experience, it's about as quick as that. Um, and in fact, thinking about just people I've worked with in the past, sometimes people tell me even walking down the aisle or, leading up to the marriage, they start to feel like maybe this isn't right. Maybe this isn't right for me, but maybe this is just like jitters. Maybe everybody walking down the aisle feels this way. And to some degree, sure. But your intuition maybe is starting to speak to you, but it's too far in, the guests are coming next Saturday, or your parents have already put the deposit down, or you're 35 and you haven't met anybody else. So who are you to be picky, right? So all these things kind of go against your intuition. You do it anyways, right? And that's okay because you don't know what you don't know at that point. But narcissists are extremely charming. And of course, they're going to say exactly what they think you want to hear. And they're going to create a facade of a life that they're going to give to you and that you're going to create together. And then once they kind of like reel you in, they got the ring on your finger and you're living together and they're controlling the finances and they're saying who you can see and who you can't see. And they're telling you that your mother's really not for you. She's, a big annoyance and your best friend's not really great for you either. And all of a sudden you're isolated, you're alone, you're confused, and you're living this nightmare that nobody knows about. And you may not be able to see a way out of that. And it's not your fault because what information did you have other than this facade that they had put on?
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think that might be a point that kind of hits home to a lot of people here right now. So if anyone wants to jump in and see something or has something, burning, they're like, oh my gosh, that's me, or something you want to say, go ahead before we move on to another question. Okay. So another question that came in beforehand was really about self-care and about kind of preserving your own sanity. How do we protect ourselves and promote our own healing when we're constantly exposed to the narcissistic behavior? For example, I have anxiety or panic when my children have FaceTimes with my ex because I can see and hear him. Just that triggers me.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a really big one. I think, again, being a mom is hard enough, right? So being a mom in a healthy relationship with the support of a spouse or your parents around or something like a good community is, I think it's hard enough. You're working a lot of times outside of the home, you have children, you're trying to multitask in lots of ways and you're trying to be superwoman, right? And then you add in all of that plus an unhealthy relationship or a history of abuse or a long-term psychologically damaging relationship or toxic unhealthy multiple toxic unhealthy people in your life. And so, yeah, so now you're in a situation where maybe you're away from that person physically, but you're still co-parenting with them. They're still in your life because you have children together. And so when I think about like, okay, this person's having panic attacks and triggers at just the sound of this person's voice over, the telephone, a couple things come to mind. We need to have support, and so that could be in the form of psychotherapy, it could be in the form of psychiatry with medication, it could be in the form of like a support group for people who are recovering from unhealthy relationships, it could be having good friends or family members right there for you. Okay, it can be exercise, massages, it can be reading good books or going to a house of worship, having some strong faith, creating art, dancing, lots of support. So I want to think about like how you like throw that net out really wide. So a lot of people come into therapy and they're like, well, Carrie, you're it, like you're my person. And that's great. That's a good starting point, like but I can't be your only person, right? So you need to build a community where you are. But for that particular situation where someone's having a panic attack because they can hear that person's voice, what I would suggest in that case, if it's possible with the age of the children, help them get set up on the Zoom call or the FaceTime, exit the room, like move out of that room and out of that space until that phone call is done. And you can say to your kids, hey, this is the green button you're going to push to start the call. When you're done talking to your dad, you're welcome to come and get me. I'll be in a different floor. I'll be outside. I'll be playing my music really loud in my bedroom. I'll be running a bath for myself. Here's where you'll find me. And you let your kid do that, because you can't interrupt necessarily, unless it's not safe to do so, the relationship that the child and the parent have, right? So they have a right to speak to their parent, and they may want to speak to the other parent. But for you, take care of yourself, know what your triggers are, and then limit yourself that exposure while you're getting the help that you need. Now, through the rest of your life, if you're talking 30, 40, 50 years, like, it's not realistic to think you're never going to hear that person's voice again or be in the same room with them. But while this is fresh, while you are working through your trauma, while you are healing and in these early stages of recovery, if you can't be around them, you can't be around them. But I also think that as you start to take care of yourself, as you join a support group or start reading books or going out on jogs with your girls club or whatever it is, as you go to the psychotherapist, those triggers will still be there, but they'll become less frequent. They'll become less intense. You'll be able to tolerate them more. But if this is, the first 2 weeks since you left in the middle of the night with your kids, and this guy's not talking to your kids, yeah, you're gonna have a traumatic response. You're gonna have panic attacks, and you need to limit that and take care of yourself to the degree that you can.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. One question we do have in chat that I want to get to, and it's kind of long, so if we need to go back to it, we can also read it again. But it says, it seems like a narcissist is the general term now for any abusive person. I've been wondering what other conditions can look like narcissism. I've heard ADHD can be one, and also the differences, if there are any, between narcissistic abuse and abuse by a person without a personality disorder. How important is it to know whether someone actually has narcissistic tendencies or if it's something different?
Yeah, that's a great question. Personally, I think it's not as important to know if they have the diagnosis almost in any situation, because you're living day to day with this person or co-parenting with them. Whether we label it narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety, I think to a degree, it doesn't really matter, because you're trying to figure out, how do I feel safe in this relationship? How do I interact with this person? Right. And so I think that's a really good point, that to me, the label isn't so important. It might be in a clinical setting to know exactly what's going on and what medications might work and what treatment modalities may or may not work. But you're living with this person, you're co-parenting with them. I think that, yes, for the person who asked the question, we had kind of touched on that earlier on, about how narcissism is now this blanket phrase that's thrown around a lot, but that only somewhere between 0.5% up to 5 or 6% of the population is diagnosed, or that's the prevalence rate in the general population, which means anywhere from 95 to 99.5% of people in the general population would not have narcissistic personality disorder. So chances are you're not living, most likely, with a diagnosed person with narcissistic personality disorder. And Jillian, I'm sorry, but I don't remember the rest of the question.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute.
Yeah.
No, I think you got most of it. It was really about, do we have to know the difference? And then also, like what can be the difference between abuse by a person who actually has narcissism and abuse by a person who doesn't have a personality disorder?
Right. So one thing I think about narcissistic personality disorder that I mentioned earlier, but will repeat, is that it's really hard to treat. It's really hard to overcome if you are diagnosed narcissistic personality disorder. But say, for example, this person has generalized anxiety, severe generalized anxiety and severe major depression. And as a result of their own internal chaos, they're acting out towards you. And maybe it's not the way that partner always was. This is some new behavior that has happened since their uncle died and they lost their job in the same week. And suddenly your spouse is no one that you recognize and have loved and had enjoyed a healthy relationship with in the past. Then it can be really helpful to say, hey, I can see that something has changed here and something's going on, and let's get you some help, and let's, move you towards some healing, to restore some balance. I think that's quite different than I never really wanted to be married to this person, but I didn't see a way out, or I was pregnant with their child, or my mother, said she would disown me if I didn't walk down the aisle, or whatever it might have been that brought you into this situation with this person that has always mistreated you. But mistreatment is mistreatment. Abuse is abuse, whether it's from a narcissist, a full-blown narcissist, or somebody who is dealing with depression. And so for you, it's about being able to set boundaries, hold boundaries, and at the same time, being compassionate towards helping someone that you love and care about get help. And that's really different than, taking ownership for that person's mental health journey.
Thank you. That was a good point. There was also something in the chat just mentioning, the stigma, and saying, this is what I was dealing with. And then I had other family members saying, well, if you speak out against it, or you go to therapy, or you get help, aren't you worried about the stigma? And I think it's really important that we talk about this, and it's why we do these Q&As, and it's why we have the group Moms for Mental Health, and why we all speak out about our own struggles, because the more we speak out, the more we know that we're not the only ones going through what we're going through, and the only way to get help is to actually seek it.
Yeah, and Jillian, can I say something to that point? This
Sure,
is not sort of loosely connected, but I've have networked with many divorce lawyers, so I know, kind of like trying to pick their brains about because people are really scared to seek treatment when they're going through a divorce or separation, worried that this may reflect badly in when they're in front of a judge, or when the custody arrangements are being made, and so forth. But I've probably talked to half a dozen lawyers, and they've all reiterated the same point, which is, in the state of Maryland, it is, generally speaking, it's favorable when the judges treat it favorably when you're seeking treatment, when you're acknowledging I have an issue and I'm seeking treatment for it, I'm getting better from it. That in general, judges like to see that, and that generally actually works in your favor versus being against. These are very wild generalizations, but I've spoken probably to a half a dozen lawyers who've reiterated that. So don't be afraid to put yourself into counseling, or to try a medication, or to seek some alternative therapy, or join a support group while you're going through this, for fear that might make you ineligible to be a co-parent. Also, in general, Maryland really stands behind a 2-parent household in terms of both parents being involved in all sorts of circumstances that you and I might find questionable, but generally that's how our court system supports having both parents involved for the sake of the child. So if you need treatment, don't let that those worries. Certainly you can speak to your lawyer or get legal advice around that, but my understanding is that it's not used against you, it's looked on favorably.
Thank you. It's a really important distinction, especially because it can be hard already to take that step and say, I need help. But then that added fear component can sometimes get in the way. So I appreciate that. Let's go back to one more question that was submitted earlier, and then we'll go ahead and take some questions from the group here. And this one's definitely about boundaries. Boundaries sound great, but actually utilizing them and actually putting them down is really difficult. So as adults, how do we set boundaries in a narcissistic relationship? And I think we went over a little bit of this with, stick to the facts, not the emotion. But that can be difficult with children. So especially with children, how do we teach them boundaries when we have family members in our lives that don't respect those?
Yeah, I saw that question. I think that's a really good one. I think that's a really great question. So one thing that I think about with children, and I think adults can use this too, is when we set our boundary, it's not just hey, no. The answer, sometimes the answer is just no, and that's it. But with a child, I was thinking about, I feel like there's been so many blog posts and different things about how we used to, at least when I was a kid, we were made to see our grandparents, for example, and get them a hug and a kiss. Even if we didn't want to. I always did. I liked my grandparents, but I could imagine that's not, something that every kid wants to do. And that there was no respect for the child's personal, physical body and their desires. But so in a situation like that, you might say to your child, if there's someone in their family who's invading their personal space, you might be able to say to them, teach the child to say, I don't want to hug you, or I'm not going to hug you, but I will shake your hand. So the child's not saying, hey, no, I'm not doing that, period, because that can make an angry parent more angry. It can make an irritable parent violent. It can be seen as disrespect. And who do you think you are to tell me no? So what you're doing, what you're teaching your child in that situation is setting the boundary. I don't want to hug you. I'm not going to hug you. I'm not okay with hugging you. But here's an alternative. Here's a healthy alternative that I am comfortable with. I'll give you a fist pump. I'll give you a high five. I'll shake your hand. I'll wink at you. I'll smile at you. right? So you're not just saying no, you're just setting like, this is something I can't do, but here's something I can do. Now, I understand with young children, you can make, if there's a pervasive person who does the same thing over and over again, that might work. We can't expect a 5-year-old or even an 8-year-old to be able to think on the fly necessarily about, I'm not going to do this, but I will do this. But help your child, prepare them. You know, I remember like raising my own kids and being able to say to them, you can't jump on the sofa, but you can sit on the sofa, right? So it's not just don't jump on the sofa. That doesn't really tell them what they can do. But when I would say to them, you can't jump on the sofa, but you can sit on the sofa, it started to give them that a fuller view of what the sofa could be used for and not used for. And I think that can be really healthy with boundaries when we're talking to people, adults and children. Here's the things I won't tolerate or can't do, and here are some things that I will do with you. And I think for your kids and for adults, what we have to remember is that our only job is to set the boundary and hold the boundary. Repeat, repeat, repeat. We cannot change the person who's constantly invading us. We cannot, that can't be the intent to make them listen to our boundaries better. Our only job is to keep putting that wall back up, keep setting it and saying it and saying it and saying it, and limiting your exposure, of course, to those people as well.
I think that's great. And it's a really important point. As frustrating as it is, boundaries are not generally a one-time thing. We don't usually put up that boundary and go, oh, cool, it's respected. We usually have to put that boundary up and then keep repairing the bricks that keep getting kicked out of it. So
That's right.
thank you.
Yeah.
It's an exhausting process.
Exactly.
We actually, we have two people kind of mentioning the same topic here in our chat. And this kind of goes back to how the narcissist is charming. There are some people in their life who are going to think this person is just like incredible and amazing and can't understand why you are treating them so poorly. So Christina says, one thing I struggle with is the so-called flying monkeys, people recruited by my ex to participate in the abuse. This includes his family members who spend time with my young, impressionable child. This sentiment was echoed by Jennifer, who says, yes, please speak to flying monkeys. My best friend of 30 years ended up sided with my ex, along with so many other people. And then Natalie replies, coworkers used as flying monkeys for a narcissist. Oh my, problematic when people aren't aware of the behaviors this person displays. So how do we even address that?
Well, I think it comes down to something that takes time, which is we're not going to be seen favorably by everybody. That there are going to be people who simply do not understand our situation, do not want to understand our situation, who've also been fed the same lies, right? So if your spouse is truly narcissistic, they use people, right? So they're using now their coworkers, their mother, their father, their children, right? Until those people are no longer useful. So for one thing, they may eventually understand your point of view when they've been hurt by the narcissist themselves, which will come, it always comes. But I think that more importantly, you have to let go of this idea that people are going to understand your choices and that they're going to support your choices. Many, many, many people will support you and believe you and stand by you and be there for you, but not everybody will. And of course, it's not uncommon for the narcissist mother, father, etc., to stand by them. That's okay. That's up to them. They can stand by whoever they want to. It's not, in my experience, it's not 100% though. A lot of times people's in-laws will say, God, I'm so sorry that he put you through that, or I'm so sorry that he was such a jerk to you, or I don't know why you married my son. He's been like that since he was 12. I mean, I've certainly heard numerous stories of that, but I think the most important thing is let go of this idea that everybody's going to understand and support you. This is your healing journey. This is your experience behind closed doors with your husband, with the father of your children. And people don't understand. And what we have to really embrace as a culture is that what you see on Instagram or social media is not the reality of people's lives. It's small snippets that are staged. And people are in really difficult situations. And if someone opens up to you and says, hey, my husband did this thing to me and it made me uncomfortable, or I'm living in a toxic or abusive relationship, do your best to understand them. Be that support for someone else that maybe you needed for yourself, but let go of the notion that everyone's going to understand and support you, because they just won't, and that it doesn't matter. And that, I think, is one of the best parts about seeing a psychotherapist, working with someone individually through that process of understanding that, yeah, you're going to shake some things up, and not everyone's going to, when you shake it all out, not everyone that was started on your side is going to be on your side. And that's okay, because it's okay to let go of some of those relationships and some of those people, but can be really hard.
Definitely some great points. We heard again in chat where it said, sometimes there are people who do see the abuse and do see the behaviors, but still they side with them anyway. And that can be common too. And, I mean, I have that in my own family. There's a very specific person who has done some true damage, and there's one person in their life that stands by them no matter what. And it seems to me that sometimes there is sort of a codependent aspect to some of these relationships where one person, even if they do see what's going on, nothing's going to change their mind about that person.
Well, and Jillian, to yes, totally. And also these people are really scary, right? So you're living with someone who's really scary. You start to see how manipulative and how they run people through the ringer and how they, cut people off and they tear them down. I mean, sometimes it's easier, right? To side with them. Okay, if I just stay on this person's good side, if I just, and it's fear and power by intimidation. But I can understand why, I mean, as an outside perspective, I can understand why some people align with these people, because better the devil you know, and you don't want to be on the wrong side of receiving, that. So I can understand why sometimes people align with them out of fear.
Absolutely. And then sometimes there's another thing in the chat where it's a parent, and sometimes
Mhm.
parents don't want to see the bad in their kids. So, no matter
Yeah.
what, their son is going to be an angel. No matter what, they're not going to do anything wrong. Let me just check the chat one more time real quick. And then I do want to see if anyone else has questions. Jennifer says this has been very powerful. It definitely has. So thank you. And then, yeah, Christina echoes 100%. Sometimes people are scared to go against them. That fear could be a powerful thing. Does anyone else have any other questions that they really want to get to, or commentary or personal things that they need to kind of speak to?
I have a couple questions.
Please.
Getting just a little bit more vulnerable, because I am seeing a therapist, and I feel like there's a couple things that I haven't even been able to break through with her, that kind of just block everything else up. And I've heard before, a lot of people who have been through abusive relationships will be like, oh, am I the narcissist? Is it me? Maybe I'm the one. And if you ask yourself that, then you're not.
Mhm.
And I've heard that, and I have such clarity for a while, and then I slide back and I'm like, wait, but maybe it is me. So I think my question is, what's the difference between an abusive relationship and a toxic one? And because I've heard different things about whether a relationship can be mutually abusive.
Oh, sure. Can I answer that to start with? Okay. That's a really, really good point, Heather. So I just want to reiterate that abuse can take lots of different forms. Physical abuse, which we see the most often, portrayed in movies and TV, hitting, biting, kicking, physical intimidation, but it also can be psychological or emotional, which if you ask anyone who's an abuse victim, they will always tell you the psychological abuse is far harder to overcome and to let go of than the physical abuse. There can be sexual abuse in marriages, there can be financial abuse in marriages, and there can be spiritual abuse. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's a good start to think of all the different forms that abuse can take. To your question about whether something's a toxic relationship or an unhealthy relationship or a narcissistic relationship, to me, they're all the same. There's some level of dysfunction, and maybe it's a spectrum of dysfunction. No relationship, of course, is perfect, but you're talking about dysfunction, which causes harm. And where it becomes really problematic is when it's pervasive, it's consistent, it keeps going and going, right? So it's one thing if you date someone 2 or 3 times, and you're like, whoa, he's a little whatever, and I don't like him, and you get out of it, and it's a few weeks or a few months in. Totally different if it's a few years in, if it's a parent that's been in your life for 4 decades. So that abuse, when it becomes pervasive and consistent in your life and long term, then it takes a long time. So someone like you, Heather, who's on this other side of coming through that recovery period. I work with a lot of clients in recovery from abusive or toxic or unhealthy relationships. It takes a long time to start to trust yourself again, to start to believe in yourself again, to trust your own reality again. And I often liken it to my biggest job is to help people trust their own intuition again, because you feel so confused about what's real. what's the reality of the situation? And maybe really it is me. Maybe I am as bad as, because you've heard it for so long and you've lived it, and you've lived with the consequences of feeling like a bad person, that you start to embody that. And then maybe you go through some other relationship and you're like, this doesn't feel good, but I can't really trust myself. I don't really know, how do I know if someone's a good person? I see a lot of people that don't know how to trust after these kind of relationships, even good people, they're in healthy relationships, but they feel like it's unhealthy because they just have lost a sense of being in connection with their own intuition, their own sense of self, and what's right and wrong in the world. So I like to think about, like, how can you rebuild your connection to yourself? And that just takes such a long time. But Heather, the other thing that I wanted to say, and I don't know if I'm answering your question exactly, but this idea of, like, is it me? Is it me? Well, first of all, like you said, if you have to ask yourself, is it me? Sure, we all have things to learn. All can improve in relationships. We all can get better in relationships. So nobody's perfect. So that's just obvious. But as I said in the beginning, narcissists typically do not go to therapy. They don't typically do well in therapy. They don't stick in therapy. They don't think there's anything wrong with them. If you're seeing a therapist, if you're working with a therapist, if you're seeing and feeling this glimpse of, like, hope that it's not me, that means you're making progress and you're just on your journey. So just keep, doing the work that you're doing to get there. But to your second point about, like, mutually abusive relationships, I think that's a really good point. If you are drawn to somebody because you might be aggressive, you might be angry, you might manipulate people or lie about things, you can draw in somebody into your life just like that. And then you can go toe to toe for a long time until you throw your hands up and say, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to be like this anymore. I don't want to be involved in this anymore. And but for sure, the other thing is, you can be a super nice, compassionate, kind person who gets wooed into some relationship with a narcissist, and then you put your gloves on because you're self protection, that you never used to be this way, but gosh, you find yourself hurling insults or throwing things against the wall or hiding money away, or going to church when you say you're going to the grocery store, because of all these abuses and isolation and tactics that are being used against you. And everybody's in survival mode in a situation like that. You're not doing your best work, but you're surviving. And sometimes that's all you can do day to day, is just survive. But when you can get out of that and you can get help, as I said, not just psychotherapy, not just psychiatry, but build a community of people like Jillian has built on the internet, but also get those real life persons, get people that you can go to the gym with, or that you can ride horses with, or paint with, or sing with, or go to support groups, or go to church with, or whatever it might be. Build a community of people that help you start to know yourself and see that other side of you that you lost touch with, that more positive side. Did I help?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. We are starting to run low on time, so we will have to start wrapping up in a moment. And I know this conversation could literally go on forever because the topic is bottomless. I just want to let people know that we can always continue this conversation in the group. Carrie is a member of the group, so she can always jump in. Also, Carrie is a therapist, so give her a call. There was a comment in the chat asking for books and resources for teaching your child about narcissism or how to deal with someone with narcissism. There's one book that I know of that's really, really great. It's called Children of the Self-Absorbed. It's definitely more for adult children, or probably even teenagers. It would be fine for those who were kind of raised by narcissistic parents. I'm not sure off the top of my head any for younger children that I would recommend. I can definitely do some research unless you know of any.
I don't off the top of my head, but I can tell you, I'm in Carroll County and my librarians are amazing. If you go to the library and tell them that you want to get some kids' books on, divorce or death or pretty much any topic, they can usually find them for you in their library, or point you in the right direction. And I'm sure that if we have that in Carroll County, I'm sure wherever county you guys are located, a librarian would be a great source. Pinterest, people make all kinds of cool Pinterest boards with, like, and I think maybe teachers and therapists do this with, like, the names of, like, titles of books on certain, maybe kids' anxiety or kids afraid to go to the doctors. So Pinterest can be really great. Obviously, Amazon, you can start Googling around on there. I don't know any off the top of my head. Narcissism, I don't know how you would address that per se with a child, but I think it's more about boundaries and like how do people make you feel? You know, what are the people that you like to be around? Why do you like to be around them? And how do you set boundaries? As I said, you know, how can you say to someone, I'm not willing to hug you, but I will shake your hand? You know, like maybe some conversations, maybe children's books will be more around boundaries and speaking clearly and directly versus mental health disorders that adults suffer from. But yeah, I don't know any other books. The other book that comes to mind is a book called Boundaries. That's an adult book. I think the person's name is Henry Cloud. I could be wrong about that. But that's a book that you often see recommended for people who just want to learn how to set boundaries and what healthy, unhealthy relationships look like and how you can take ownership of your time and your energy, and how you can be the person who puts up those boundaries and how you keep them.
Perfect. I think the librarian is a great point. I mean, that's literally their world is books and knowing how to
Right.
find the book you're looking for, even if you don't know
Right.
exactly what you're looking for.
Right.
But those are two great books you and I both mentioned to get started with, at least for adults. We can probably take one more question, and then I would like Carrie to wrap up with final statement on your part, as well as, you know, how to contact you. Does anyone in the group have a final question we'd like to address?
Can I ask one thing?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure if you will really even be able to answer this, but how do you deal with an ex that is not just, you know, emotionally, psychologically abusive, but is also abusing the court system to try to punish you? I mean, my ex has tried to take out false restraining orders against me. He's called welfare checks to my house. I mean, like, the police know this guy for doing these types of things. And I feel like even when you get to like custody court, the judges don't really take psychological or verbal or emotional abuse into consideration, like, at all.
Yeah, it's really tough. Every once in a while you get somebody like this, and I've worked with spouses of people in this situation where the lengths that the ex will go to manipulate the system and how long, frustratingly long it takes for anything to get in place, you know, whether the wool's being pulled over the eyes of the judges or the lawyers. You know, my best advice to you, Christina, is arm yourself with a good lawyer, you know, document the heck out of everything, you know, record, document, make copies of, you know, talk to your schools. If the kids are missing schools on the day that they're with the spouse, or they're not going to doctor's appointments on the days of the spouse, or they're consistently late, you know, just document. The other thing is, and I don't know exactly, and you'd have to ask your lawyer if you're not working with a lawyer, definitely get a good lawyer, right? But if you could ask them about best interest attorneys. Have you ever heard that term? Have they talked to you about having a best interest attorney? Do you have one for your children?
I don't. I think just
Okay.
because he's so young. I mean, he's not even 2, so.
Oh, so he's not verbal, right? Or right. So a best, just since I brought it up, a best interest attorney can be appointed by the court. You can't go out and get one yourself. You can't pay for one yourself. But if the court sees a really, really contentious divorce going on with children involved, the court can decide to appoint something called a best interest, a BIA attorney, which is an attorney for the child who has no ability to say, oh, mom does this and dad does this, and this is what's best for me. So the court can appoint you, and of course you have to pay for it. And this attorney will interview the child in both homes, at school. They'll talk to any providers that are involved, family members. And then this attorney supports the child and says, this is what's best for the child. And this is only the most contentious and difficult divorces. And as I said, you can't go out and hire one yourself. It has to be court appointed, but it could be an avenue to talk to your own lawyer about, you know, at what point could this be part of our journey. The other thing is, you can always ask for psychological evaluation of your partner, but just know that they will then evaluate you as well. So that it's, you know, if you want to pull that one, then you have to be subjected to it as well. And again, I don't know all the ins and outs of how one goes about doing that, but that's again something you talk to your lawyer about.
Yeah.
It's a really
Thank you.
hard situation. Yeah, it's such a hard situation.
Oh, sorry, was someone else speaking? Okay. I think you really hit the nail on the head, Carrie, when you said these are difficult situations. And unfortunately, every situation is going to be extremely unique. So you could give the most concrete, valuable insight someone's ever given, and it might work really great for one person. It might not work at all for another. And I think that's so important that we recognize that these are not one size fits all situations. And that's why it's really important to have the support, whether that's peers, friends, family, or whether it is the help of a mental health therapist or the court system. You need to arm yourself with the best protection possible in all forms. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I think this was definitely enlightening, and I hope it was helpful to a lot of people listening now and a lot of people who are going to be listening after the fact. Do you have any final thoughts, and then also best ways to contact you?
Yeah, I guess like in summary, I haven't really had a thought about how to summarize it all, but I just want to reiterate what you're saying, Jillian. You know, it's such a hard situation for people to find themselves in, and the recovery process, the healing process and the recovery from coming out of these relationships is it's long and it's arduous. It's totally worth it. As you get the healing and you get further and further away from the abuse that you suffered, you become such a different person than you were before. So if you were engaged in behavior that was out of, you know, your integrity and not really who you are, you know, just honor the fact that you were doing the best you could in that situation. It might not have been your best. It might not have been good enough, but you know, everybody's trying their best. Give yourself some space and some time, take care of yourself. Believe in yourself and that your ability to heal, and that, you know, in your good qualities, surround yourself with people who make you feel good about yourself, and do your work. You know, like there's something to learn in these relationships about yourself, about how you interact with in the world, how you show up in the world. So use it as a catalyst to get, you know, become a stronger and better person. And yeah, just give yourself time, because these things take time to heal from. Jillian, I think you asked me for contact info. It's so
Yeah, best ways to reach you or
yeah,
connect with you after the fact.
Sure, of course. On my website, marylandtherapycarrie.com, you can find ways to email me or call me. I'm often on your Facebook page, Jillian, answering questions as best as I can, trying to keep up with all of that. But I am happy to help people connect to therapists to find right. I know lots of therapists in this area. So if I'm not the right therapist for you, or if I don't have an opening that suits you, I can help you find somebody who can. Psychology Today, Therapy Den, and Zen Care are 3 other websites that you can use to Google therapists in your area, by zip code and by insurance and by your challenge area. So that'd be Therapy Den, Psychology Today, Zen Care, I think are 3 that I can think of off the top of my head where people can find therapists. And I just want to plug too that most counties in the state of Maryland have a mobile crisis team. So if you're in Anne Arundel County or Carroll County, you can Google your county's mobile crisis team. They're usually manned, not always 24 hours a day, but usually something like 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. or 8 to 10 p.m. And that would be a number that you can call if you're in crisis or you need help. And usually you'll get a licensed mental health professional and sometimes a police officer coming together to help you. They can meet you on the side of the road. They can meet you at the grocery store. They can meet you in your home and de-escalate any emergency that you're going through. And of course, there's lots of hotlines for rape victims and National Suicide Prevention Hotline, RAIN for sexual assault victims. So there's lots of nationwide helplines too for people if you're feeling in crisis or vulnerable after this conversation.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. For anyone who wants to continue this conversation after we log off, of course, Moms for Mental Health Facebook page. You can also go right into the event, right into the Facebook event for our, what do we call it? Narcissism, Let's Talk Boundaries. I think that's what we called it. Yes. Yeah, we called it Narcissism, Let's Talk Boundaries, right under the event. So even though the event itself was passed, that event is still open. So if you have other questions we didn't get to, drop them in there and we'll be sure to get it covered. So yeah. Thank you all. Yeah. And I respect each and every one of you. And I thank you all so much for joining this and being a part of it. We really couldn't do it without any of you. So, you know, not just our experts, but also our members as well. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jillian, for having me and for bringing up this such important conversation. Thank you. Absolutely. And we'll definitely get the recording up on the page later this afternoon. So feel free to share it there or listen for the recap if you didn't get to log on at the beginning. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.